And what I was thinking for this little presentation is if I could maybe just share the artistic journey so far. Talk about my training, talk about early work, my teaching style and process, and then also look at current work. I think it'd also be fun to talk about the delicate balance of trying to hold true to one's kind of self, to one's vision, while also trying to kind of navigate the choppy waters of everyday life, trying to make a living, to make a life of as an artist. So at the very least, it should be fun. And if anyone's not satisfied by the end, you can have a full refund. All requests are granted. I think this is free, right? That should not be a problem. If questions come up throughout, feel free to pop those in the chat, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for question and answers. So yeah, so let's jump into it. What I want to prevent from happening. As it's developing, I don't want that expression and the intensity to go away. I want to keep it. What does that require? It requires less painting, just better mark making. Make those subtle tweaks in every place that just intensify and clarify the expression. So that's just a little excerpt from one of my recent online classes. But what I think is interesting is let's see how we got here. So I went to a small atelier in London that was created by a collective of working artists. And I'll never forget the very first day. I was, I don't know, 17 or 18 years old. And the school director, Bernard Saunders, sat us down and said, the aim of the course is threefold: to master your subject, to master yourself, and to have a glorious vision for the future. I now affectionately refer to these as the 3 precepts of Saint Bernard. The course was a 3-year course. The drawing was the foundation. It's all we did the first year. Drawing extensively from life and primarily from the nude. We copied plaster casts, observational drawings from sculpture, both in the studio and at museums. We did extensive life drawing, but one of my favorite subjects was portrait painting. And there's something timeless that comes through when working on a portrait. Year 2 had a strong emphasis on drawing still, but also introduced painting and sculpture. Exploring form through 3 dimensions really brought depth to painting. Those 2 disciplines together felt really important. In painting classes, we worked primarily in egg tempera and oil. And in contrast, the deep, rich, quick pace of oil, which we see on the left, there's something mesmerizing about the luminous aspect of egg tempera we see on the right. And so we will know egg tempera from people like Andrew Wyeth and, of course, the early Renaissance painters. In our 3rd year, we specialized, and I loved sculpture, but for practical reasons, focused on painting. Even before finishing studies, I was already doing portrait commissions and exhibiting in galleries throughout the UK. I was lucky to have found a client base that loved my work and were willing to help spread the word. I had as much work as I could handle, and very fortunate, began to feel like, okay, being a painter is viable. And after 8 years or so, and mostly due to visa reasons, I returned from the UK to the US. Fortunately landed on my feet again, and I did many more portrait commissions. Lots of long hours in the studio painting. This one was quite a prestigious one, but I'll tell you more about that later. In between portrait commissions, I painted landscape. Felt like a really good counterpart to the studio work, right? Great way to practice, push skills, get fresh air, of course, and generally make more sellable work. Painting water was and still is one of my favorite subjects. But more than anything, I was in love with creating beautiful images, work that carried a feeling and a wish that the viewer might feel a sense of awe or wonder when looking at the work, an aesthetic arrest that evokes a sense of stillness or peace. I mean, maybe someone seeing the work would also feel that. Could a painting be so compelling that it stops a viewer in their tracks? I love that as an aim. All those years doing commissions was great. I mean, I was making a living. I was super grateful for it. You know, being in the studio for those long hours is also quite lonely. And something for me felt like it was missing. Then back in New York City, I was painting at the Art Students League when I saw the work of Max Ginsburg. Oh, he's a world-renowned alla prima painter. You probably know his work. And if not, just take a look. This is a portrait that I did of Max. He's 94 years old, still going strong, still painting, still traveling. Alla prima means painted at once, or at first, or the first time, right? The goal is to finish the painting in one setting. It demands high levels of skill and certainly confidence. Joined the class and right away I was hooked, right? Trying to get like a good likeness and finish the work in only a few hours. It was super challenging, but also super addicting. This way of working brought new meaning to those 3 precepts from my old schoolmaster: to master oneself and to master one subject. This mastery is a well that has no bottom. We all know that. So on the left, this is fun, was a painting I was doing of the model in the class, right? And most of this work is from life, right? And then on the right was a painting I was secretly doing of Max while he was painting. And then when he came round to do critiques, he looked at me, he smiled, he pinched my cheek. And this is one of those moments like I'll never forget, right? I could have sold that painting 50 times. Everyone loved it. Well, including Miriam, who's Max's wife. So quite rightly, it went to them. You know, it took a few years to really feel like I was getting the hang of the alla prima process. Alla prima is like a sport. I mean, time and skill are like opposing teams. Slowly, over time, with endless practice, right? I felt like I was finally making some progress. Like these paintings here, you know, the one on the left is, I think that was done in 4 hours. And then the one on the right was actually done over the course of a few evenings, but totaling about 6 hours. There's a lot of factors that make a good painting, many of them internal. Demands a focused but relaxed mind, efficient brushwork that isn't hasty or impulsive, but well observed. And just like a sport, it's exhilarating and frustrating at the same time. And this is because the outcome is unknown. With patience, we learn how to ride that wave of uncertainty. I love what the poet David Whyte says. He says, "A true vocation calls us out beyond ourselves, breaks our heart in the process, and then humbles, simplifies, and enlightens us about the hidden core nature of the work that enticed us in the first place." This was a big part of what was missing, the daily practice from life, that sense of challenge, of meeting the difficulty face on. But there was another part, contribution, and that's when I started teaching. So my first workshop was on painting self-portraits. Working with others, by sharing in that struggle, teaching feels like a meaningful contribution, almost on a daily basis. And let me give you an example. This painting was definitely an inflection point in my painting practice. Pat is a well-known, loved model in New York City. It's funny, he would keep himself awake after posing for a long day by eating jalapenos. And he wouldn't even budge, but you'd see his face get a little bit redder. Anyway, so this painting was done from life. So my goal was to push it as far as I could. In that limited time frame, challenge of alla prima is to build it up at once. But the issue is that if we misjudge the proportions and values, it really works against us. Because I felt like I was pushing paint around, moving features slightly, changing the shape, working diligently, but not really breaking through. In fact, some nights, despite my effort, and after a long day, I felt like I made it worse. And if there's anything soul-destroying, it's that. And you know exactly what I mean. I needed a more structured approach to make the process more predictable. It's like not so over-engineered that it killed the joy, but definitely a balance between the spontaneity and the discipline. I realized that like the underlying proportions and shapes do all the work. And this wasn't news. I mean, every good teacher always says this. And I was saying this to my students, but it didn't really crystallize until this moment. That insight then became the foundation of my teaching process, which is kind of more of a hybrid between alla prima or direct painting and indirect painting. So that day, when I finished that, I decided the next day I'm going to try something new. And I did this portrait of Kathy in just a few hours. However, this time working from those insights. So working big to small, pattern to detail, average color to varied color, letting the detail come at the end of the painting, not at the beginning of the painting. Very encouraging, because I always felt like a dupe. If I couldn't do what I was teaching, then it didn't feel right. But if I could do it, then surely my students could do it too. So distilling the drawing and painting into simple and manageable steps, I felt really weeded out a lot of the unnecessary struggle. Here's a painting of the writer Neil Gaiman with this process. right? So that painting was like approximately 3 hours. And so what's interesting is in a way what isn't changing as we're going through the process. So this was a big step for me. Whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, 3 hours, there's a process in place. And the painting is always done at the end of the session. Now, the thing that varies, of course, is the detail and finish, right? And the really big variable is the quality, right? But that said, the more I work this way, the more consistent the work is, which means it's less about working for the results and much more about showing up and putting in the practice. If I want a greater finish and subtlety, then I just increase the time. But the process more or less remains the same. This is the way I teach, by demoing and explaining it as I'm working, and then I give critique and instruct throughout the class. I also welcome questions, and I find that this is just the right balance as it touches on a little bit of all of it. This 1 hour demo painted during a live class marks another really meaningful moment, right? Each step just 12 minutes long. So from beginning to end, it felt almost effortless, as if the painting painted itself. I know, it's so cliche, but so true. It showed me a beautiful sense of potential, like a clear day where you can see for miles. And this isn't the end of the journey. It's like, I feel probably closer to the beginning, but it's an encouraging milestone. And each one of us probably has these throughout our career. So not only was I helping students, but now I also felt like an important part was being fulfilled. Being part of something bigger, taking on challenge, contributing. So over time, I did a lot of teaching, like a lot. So much so that I didn't have time for commissions or really anything else. Part of it was simply about being busy, teaching live classes, traveling for workshops. Very disruptive for the daily schedule. But also, it was about learning about how to be a good teacher, to get good at anything, to really give it the proper time and care it needs. It takes all of our time and attention. Just when things were falling into place, COVID hit. Yep. And worse, we had just bought a townhouse. Yeah. Suddenly, a year's worth of scheduled classes and workshops up in the air. Just like that. It forced me to jump into the digital world. I learned all I could about online teaching software, cameras, and started teaching online like pretty quick. It was an intense time, as you all no doubt remember. With many of us being at home, online teaching was actually a huge success. In an unexpected way, it kind of provided community and creativity in a new form. Strange silver lining in the chaos. Basically, it's all I did for 2 years. But, I was sort of in the inverse situation that I was in when doing lots of commission. I mean, the online classes were awesome, definitely meaningful, but I was yearning for something. I've always felt that art has the power to transform, heal, and inspire. After all, that's why I got into it. And I still feel that. And I wasn't feeling that at the time, right? Something was still missing. And then one night, something happened. I went on an amazing date. It's the best date I've ever been on. The next bit's gonna disappoint you though. It was a date with myself. You see, just when you thought this talk was gonna pay off and get spicy, a little bit interesting. But anyway, hear me out, it might still be worth it. So, one night, right? I was listening to a Rich Roll podcast and was really moved by the story of Hella Sidibe. As I was listening, I picked up the brush and started painting. Hella is a former soccer player for the Seattle Sounders, in fact, and he was the first Black person to run solo across the United States. That's 3,200 miles, right? From LA to New York in just 84 days, averaging 38 miles per day with no days off. Moreover, he's maintained that running streak for over 4 years. He uses his platform to raise awareness for charity, and his tagline is "no matter the circumstance." And this was his mantra for getting through that epic run. Talk about determination. So what's interesting is this painting was the first in a weekly series that would become date night. I would simply paint whoever caught my attention, and there was no particular order, just that whatever they were doing was moving. It was meaningful and having some positive impact in the world. That was my criteria. I would listen to them and I painted while I listened. I tried to find a way to allow the quality of their words and their spirit enter the brush and hopefully get onto the canvas. I saw Fred Rogers' acceptance speech for a Lifetime Achievement Award. He shared a story of asking his mother about all the wrong happening in the world and what do you do about it? And she said, "Don't be afraid, just look to those who are helping. There are always people helping." And then he asked all of us to remember all those who helped us on our way. Do you feel that? As I'm listening and painting on, my epic tears rolling down the cheeks, and no doubt anyone who's heard him give this talk also felt that. Jane Goodall talks about being in Africa as a young, curious child, that once she sat for hours in a chicken coop and just waiting to see how a hen lays her egg. Her family was terrified she was lost, or worse, kidnapped, and searched for hours for her. When they found her, her mother, rather than reproaching her, nurtured that curiosity. And of course, as we all know, Jane Goodall went on to break all sorts of social norms. So by becoming a pioneering female scientist, kind of full stop, but especially in primatology, by conducting solo research in the wild and challenging traditional views about animal emotions and behavior, her discoveries about chimps using tools and complex social lives transformed our understanding of animals and made her a natural leading advocate for conservation and animal welfare. It's so easy to forget the trailblazers and their contribution to the world. We grow used to it. So in a way, like date night is my small attempt to remind myself, right, and to remember and to nurture this sort of presence. This painting is called Stealing Souls. David Gauguin overcame abuse, poverty, racism, and at 300 pounds describes himself as weak and undisciplined. He tries to join the Navy SEALs and was laughed at. They told him lose 100 pounds and come back. He then, untrained, ran a 70-mile race within a 24-hour period in order to qualify for some marathon or some ultra marathon. He was peeing blood at the end of it. He had broken limbs. He was taped his foot together, basically, and he finished it. And 3 months later, he went back to that recruitment office, 100 pounds lighter, and joined. Literally, you can look it up. He went on to do all manner of crazy things, like running a 100-mile race every weekend for 7 weeks straight, setting world records. He's famous for pushing through any form of adversity. And what I love is how, like, these are the two sides of the same coin. So, well, let me explain this. When I hear David Gauguin speak, I always think of the story of David and Goliath. Here we see 3 representations of the same story. So Donatello did this at the end of his career. Nothing to prove, already a celebrated artist. Verrocchio follows the mold closely with a realism and grace that is striking, but still shows the deed is done. The scale of Goliath's head leaves nothing for the imagination, and David's youthful and undeveloped form definitely does not convey a believable sense of strength or toil, right? It is gorgeous. Michelangelo, however, breaks the mold. He shows us the moment before the deed is done, the moment of courage, a moment of intense tension, right? A strong and determined youth, a moment in which Michelangelo is a youth himself at the beginning of his career and has a lot of ambition and a lot to prove. The deed is not yet done. He doesn't show Goliath. And this is powerful, right? Because fear can take any size and shape, and it leaves it to our imagination. But more importantly, we can see ourselves in David. That's powerful art. So David Gauguin talks about slaying the Goliath, not just once, but every day, with its many forms and faces. So I wanted to paint him with a moment with this characteristic, laser-focused, unrelenting determination to meet any challenge. That was the goal. David Gauguin says, when people see you coming out of the other side of adversity, still standing tall, that's the moment you've stolen their souls. It's like a little slight gasp of air when you hear this, especially when you listen to all of the things he's done. You know he means it. So we all have small moments of this, right? That determination to push through, even when we think the most likely outcome is failure, and yet we did it, right? I love the idea that an artwork can be an aid to give us courage in these moments when we most need it. Neil Gaiman is a novelist and a master storyteller. He says, dragons may not be real, but they can be defeated. He also says, life is always going to be stranger than fiction, because fiction has to be convincing and life doesn't. Whether our struggles are self-created or created from the outside, they're there nonetheless, and we all struggle, and this is what we have in common. And all the great myths are stories speaking to this struggle, and the aim, of course, is to provide hope, insight, and courage. So Neil Gaiman also said, life is a disease, sexually transmitted, and invariably fatal. So a good dose of humor is also Very essential. So here we have Sadhguru. I really like him, but mostly really wanted to paint his beard. In fact, I had just finished some pad thai when I was listening to one of his podcasts, and I saw a plastic fork laying there and thought, brilliant, just the tool I need to paint the beard. So Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that the most precious gift we can offer anyone is our attention. When mindfulness embraces those we love, they will bloom like flowers. Rainer Maria Rilke reminds us that we do not need to seek the answers which cannot be given to us now, because we would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps we will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Ooh, come on. We need more of this in our daily life. When Betty White was asked beauty advice, she says this, right? Make sure you get 8 hours of sleep. But she also said 9 hours if you're ugly. Well done, Betty. Around the time that she passed away, during my online class, we did a posthumous portrait of her, commemorate her. But also, I wanted to paint her because as a child, I would watch Golden Girls with my grandmother. And it also felt like a tribute to her. So the funny thing is, though, that this is the second painting. This was the first painting. It was in a show in Canada and was sold during the opening. Of course, that's great, but the problem was it was supposed to be part of a very important show in New York City. But unfortunately, the timing between the shows didn't work. So I did what anyone would do in this situation, and I painted it again. Right? It was all good because I didn't really capture her the way I intended in the first one. Whereas in the second one, I was able to get her playfulness, the infectious smile that she had. So I could have sold that painting 10 times. There was a lot of interest. But it did give me an idea for a series, which I think you're gonna love, right? But if you want to hear about it, you're gonna have to join my newsletter. I know that's really mean. That's really mean just to hang it out like that. Sorry, that's just how it has to be. Okay, so during COVID, there were many more date nights, right? But I'll just show you 3 more. So Dr. Gabor Mate is a trauma, addiction, and stress specialist in British Columbia. His work was instrumental for me in my late 20s, early 30s. And while listening to a podcast between him and Russell Brand, I did this painting of him. So do you remember this painting from earlier? Okay, well, as it turns out, this portrait was commissioned by Hugh and Deborah Lee Jackman. You probably know the actor as playing Wolverine or from his Broadway work. They wanted me to paint their son Oscar, and I had the idea of painting Deb because, well, Oscar's walking an elephant down the street, and I figured he probably should be supervised. So it was a little fun. Anyway, it's an interesting story for another time, that painting. We hit it off, and I became Deb's painting instructor. Well, as it turns out, she was interviewing Gabor for one of her charities, and she sent him a picture of the painting. So a couple days later, I received an email from Gabor, and he wanted to buy the painting. Being close to Vancouver, I drove up there to deliver the painting, and meeting him and his wife Ray was utterly delightful. I left feeling like I had spent time with a really old friend. And look, this is super meaningful because having had such an incredible impact on me in my 30s as I navigated some very choppy emotional waters, it was such a delight to see that recognition in his eyes when I unveiled the portrait and heard him say, "Oh wow," just like that. Another moment I'll never forget, that beautiful moment of recognition. But funny enough, it wasn't even a great photo. The painting was made from a screenshot of a Russell Brand podcast. Thing is, I loved Gabor's expressions. It really caught his character. Some days later, Gabor forwarded me an email from Russell Brand. He said that he was happy to be a handmaid to the muse. That's kind of sweet, right? Anyway, here's a time lapse of the painting of Gabor. Art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. Great quote by Thomas Merton. So, perhaps, two of my favorite contemporary writers are the late philosopher-poet John O'Donohue and one of his dearest friends, poet-philosopher David Whyte. So John says poetry tries to draw alongside the mystery as it's emerging and somehow bring it into presence. I think the same could be said for painting, right? But mostly John teaches me about that appreciation of the mystery of life. He says, when your life awakens and you begin to sense the destiny that brought you here, you endeavor to live a life that is generous and worthy of the blessing and invitation that is always calling you. I was visiting a friend on Whidbey Island, just outside of Seattle, and we were driving out to dinner, and I was about to ask her if she knew anybody who knew David Whyte, because I did a portrait of John O'Donohue, and I thought he would like to see it. So we stop at the stop sign at the end of the street, and I'm mid-sentence, and I look out the window to my right, and I see David Whyte watering his garden. It happened just like that. I will stand by this to my grave. It couldn't have been scripted any better. A few days later, we were in touch, and he said that he absolutely loved the portrait and wanted to purchase it. Soon thereafter, I drove back to the island to deliver it. David is one of my living literary heroes, and I was doubly honored when he said that he would like to sit for a portrait. So that will happen sometime later this year. Okay, here's the last one, right? So the moment of inspiration for this one was undeniable. I saw Anne standing in front of her work. She's a ceramicist and gallerist here in Seattle, right? Traver Gallery. And her work is earthly, organic, sensitive, and somehow embodies presence. You really feel like it's alive when you see it. So while working on the painting, I realized that these weren't pots. I mean, you wouldn't put something in it, because in a strange sense, they're already full, or they're alive, right? They're vessels. They're shaped by her hands. They're extensions of her hands. And they're crafted with like an exquisite care and sensitivity. They are memory and time captured in form. They're made of clay, each beautiful in its own way, right? The story sort of evolved over the course of doing the painting. But the word I kept coming back to is vessel. And then I asked myself, what is a vessel, right? But then I asked, like, well, what isn't a vessel? What doesn't evolve? What doesn't hold memory, right? We are vessels, made of the same clay, crafted with the same and exquisite care. Each row of vessels is a stage of life. As the 4 stages move up the painting, they refine and develop as they go. The ones on the bottom are the least developed, the ones on the top the most. I love that. I love that analogy to life. She looks toward the source of inspiration while holding a vessel she says is unfinished, right? One she says she doesn't particularly like. The vessel is tipped toward the light. She's tipped towards the light, and maybe it's unfinished, but it collects light and glows nonetheless. The cracks are where the light gets in, said Leonard Cohen. So I'm beginning to see a faint outline of that 3rd precept from my old school director, a vision of the glorious future for art. Creating works of art that tell a story, bring beauty and a poignant message into the world, coupled with teaching. These 2 disciplines side by side feels like the alchemy that I've been searching for. That inward connection to that creative source, to oneself, and then the outward expression of art and the service to others through teaching. These are the 2 wings of the same bird. So the crazier part of this is the painting and some of the studies sold almost as soon as the paint was dry. And it could have sold several times. One of my clients was really upset that she didn't get the painting. Now, let me be clear. I really don't like the idea of commoditizing one's innermost truth. Certainly not with Q1 sales. Somehow that feels like the wrong direction. But the only reason I bring up that idea is that, well, I mean, after so many years of effort and struggle and dedication, it shows me that there is a small space where being true to one's core and making a living can overlap, that one doesn't have to sacrifice that internal vision, that there is a way. It's not easy, but it's possible. So this is a massive validation. But more importantly, it allows the story to keep going, right? and for new adventures to be taken, new beauty to be seen and created. So that's why I feel it's so important. It's the world saying you've been tested and stayed true. You passed the test. Now keep going, keep digging, keep doing this. And if you do, you'll be fine. Now, if I keep going on like this, everyone's definitely going to want a refund. So let's wrap this up. Before I hand it back to Ellen for questions, I just wanted to share a little bit of news. The best part of all this, really, truly, is meeting you and working together, because it doesn't happen otherwise. And if you want to, here are some options. I teach an in-person class on Tuesday mornings, a short pose online class on Wednesday mornings, a long pose online class on Thursday mornings, and also, of course, workshops nationally and internationally. If live classes aren't your thing, you can watch and work at your own pace with replay. These are instructional videos. And I mean, of the many paintings that you've seen today, a lot of them are already in private collections. But if you're inspired by it, you can take a look at the online store, see what's available. Each piece is unique. There's something special about owning an original. So take a look, see if you find something that speaks to you. And if it isn't too far from Seattle, I will hand deliver it. Anyway, so thanks for being here, and now I would love to pass this back to Ellen for questions, if there are any.